It was February, in the year 1779. Freezing rain battered the unmapped western wilderness endlessly. A small force stood near the Wabash River. 170 starving American militiamen waited. They stared out at an impossible flooded landscape. Heavy storms had drowned the entire Illinois country. The freezing water stretched for endless gray miles. Submerged trees poked through the vast icy surface. These men had marched for 18 grueling days. They walked over 200 completely unmapped miles. Nobody packed warm tents for this brutal journey. They possessed absolutely no supply wagons at all. The desperate soldiers had not eaten in days. Now a massive flooded plain blocked their path. The target sat just 5 miles away now. A heavily armed British garrison waited at Vincennes. The British commander slept inside Fort Sackville comfortably. He believed his remote position was completely unassailable. The savage winter floods protected his strong walls. No army could possibly cross that icy sea. He expected safety until the warm spring arrived. His assumption proved to be a fatal mistake. The American commander was a young Virginia militiaman. George Rogers Clark refused to turn his men around. He scooped black gunpowder into his wet hands. He painted his face like an Indian warrior. He unleashed a terrifying and blood-curdling war cry. Clark plunged chest-deep into the freezing water. He never looked back at his shivering men. His starving soldiers followed him into the abyss. This was not a normal, conventional fighting force. They were frontiersmen, pushed past extreme human limits. Clark was about to execute a tactical masterclass. He designed a brilliant trap of psychological warfare. The British fort would soon be completely surrounded. The impossible siege would force a shocking surrender. These freezing men changed American history that night. Their insane mission doubled the new nation's size. But how did Clark pull off this miracle? You must understand the Western frontier nightmare first. The American Revolution was a brutal coastal conflict. But the Western frontier was a different nightmare. Settlers in Kentucky faced constant and terrifying attacks. The British government funded this ruthless shadow war. They wanted to destroy the American Western expansion. British agents operated from distant forts like Detroit. They freely handed out weapons to tribal warriors. They paid lucrative bounties for the scalps of settlers. Isolated pioneer cabins burned in the middle of night. Families were slaughtered without any warning or mercy. The frontier bled while Washington fought back east. Nobody could stop these devastating inland Indian raids. The Continental Congress had absolutely no money to spare. They sent 0 soldiers to defend the Deep West. Kentucky pioneers begged for urgent military assistance daily. They were entirely alone in a hostile remote wilderness. Survival meant fighting a shadowy and deadly unseen enemy. George Rogers Clark watched his friends die very violently. He realized defensive tactics would never actually work here. You cannot defend an endless thick forest from ambushes. The brutal attacks would continue until the source fell. Clark knew he had to strike the British directly. He needed to capture their heavily fortified frontier outposts. He rode all the way back east for help. Clark pitched his wild tactical idea to Patrick Henry. The Virginia governor listened closely to the desperate plan. Henry authorized a highly secret expedition into enemy territory. He gave Clark virtually no money or proper supplies. Clark had to recruit his own rugged frontier fighters. He gathered a tiny force of very rough woodsmen. They paddled down the mighty Ohio River, completely silently. Their ultimate strategic goal seemed completely and utterly suicidal. They planned to conquer an entire unmapped wild empire. They would face a notoriously brutal British garrison commander. His extremely cruel methods struck fear into every settler. He was a ruthless man who bought human hair. He rewarded brutal violence with heavy bags of gold. Nobody expected Clark to actually challenge this powerful monster. Lieutenant Governor Henry Hamilton ruled the western frontier ruthlessly. He operated out of the heavily fortified Fort Detroit. The Americans gave him a very dark, chilling nickname. They called him the infamous hair-buyer general. Hamilton officially denied ever paying for actual human scalps. But the terrified settlers knew the bloody truth entirely. He showered native war parties with precious British trade goods. He provided them with shiny muskets and sharp hatchets. Warriors returned to Detroit, displaying their gruesome, bloody trophies. Hamilton rewarded their lethal raids with generous supply shipments. This brutal proxy war devastated the small Kentucky settlements. Hamilton wanted to terrorize the pioneers into total submission. He believed panic would shatter the fragile American rebellion. In late 1778, Hamilton made a very aggressive tactical move. He marched south to capture the town of Vincennes. His large force easily took control of Fort Sackville. The British commander rebuilt the fort with massive timbers. He stationed disciplined redcoats to guard the thick walls. Hamilton now controlled a vital choke point in Illinois. He planned a massive, coordinated spring offensive against Kentucky. He intended to wipe out every single American settler. Thousands of warriors would attack when the snow melted. The pioneer families faced total and absolute bloody annihilation. George Rogers Clark intercepted urgent intelligence about this plan. He realized the grim reality of the changing situation. Waiting for the spring meant certain death for everyone. The massive British army would easily crush their homes. Clark had to do something completely unpredictable and insane. He decided to attack Hamilton during the freezing winter. Military rules declared winter campaigns to be totally impossible. Armies simply did not move through deep freezing mud. Hamilton felt perfectly safe behind his thick wooden walls. He dismissed the scattered Americans as weak, untrained farmers. He severely underestimated the sheer desperation of frontier riflemen. Clark was about to prove the British commander wrong. The deadly trap was finally set into sudden motion. George Rogers Clark called his men together very quickly. He explained the incredibly dangerous and desperate tactical situation. Hamilton would launch a massive attack in the spring. They had to strike Fort Sackville before winter ended. His frontiersmen stared at him in complete stunned silence. Vincennes was over 200 miles away through wilderness. The journey required marching through completely unmapped, flooded territory. European generals considered winter campaigns to be totally suicidal. You simply cannot march an army through freezing floods. Men would die from extreme exposure along the way. But Clark understood the brutal reality of their situation. They could either die freezing or die fighting Hamilton. The element of total surprise was their only weapon. Hamilton would never expect an attack in this weather. The British commander felt entirely secure inside his fortress. Clark recruited 170 rugged frontier fighters. They were a tough mix of Virginia and French militia. These men survived by hunting in the dense wild woods. They packed very light rations and carried long rifles. There were absolutely no warm tents for this mission. They carried no heavy artillery or vital medical supplies. It was a desperate gamble born from extreme necessity. On February 5th, the small ragged army marched outward. They left the muddy safety of Kaskaskia completely behind. The weather immediately turned into a freezing cold nightmare. Freezing rain poured down on the small marching column. The dirt trails instantly dissolved into deep, thick mud. The first few days were physically exhausting and miserable, but the worst part of the journey waited ahead. The Great Wabash River had completely flooded its banks. The water transformed the landscape into a freezing ocean. They were walking straight into a brutal frozen hell. Nobody believed humans could survive this deadly icy march. The incredible suffering had only just begun for them. The real test of their willpower was approaching fast. Clark prepared to lead them into the drowned lands. The American march quickly became a total physical nightmare. Freezing rain battered the exhausted men without any mercy. Thick freezing mud sucked heavily at their tired boots. They walked through miles of endless dark flooded forests. Every single step required massive amounts of physical effort. The icy wind sliced right through their wet clothing. These tough frontiersmen carried absolutely no warm winter gear. They slept on soaking wet ground in freezing temperatures. Nobody dared to light a warm fire at night. A bright fire would alert enemy scouts almost immediately. The harsh conditions pushed them past normal human endurance. Food rations disappeared entirely after just a few days. The starving soldiers hunted for whatever animals they could. But the flooded landscape chased all the wildlife away. Hunger twisted their empty stomachs into sharp, painful knots. Some men began falling asleep while they were walking. Exhaustion slowly eroded their sharp minds and strong bodies. Clark watched his desperate men suffering in silent agony. He knew their fragile morale could shatter very quickly. He constantly moved among his tired troops, offering encouragement. The young commander refused to show any personal weakness. He led them straight into the most dangerous territory. The icy floodwaters grew much deeper with every mile. They crossed swollen creeks that felt like freezing rivers. Men slipped under the dark water and nearly drowned. Comrades quickly pulled them out from the icy depths. They were marching toward an impossible and suicidal battle. Any normal army would have completely mutinied by now. British soldiers would never endure this incredible physical torture. But these tough Americans refused to quit their mission. They trusted George Rogers Clark with their very lives. The ultimate test of their survival still waited ahead. The drowned lands of the Wabash River finally appeared. They stared at a terrifying ocean of freezing water. The deadliest part of their journey was just beginning. Nothing could prepare them for this absolute freezing hell. They had to cross this impossible water to survive. The Wabash River Valley was completely underwater now. 5 endless miles of freezing floodwater blocked their path. The starving men stared at the deadly icy sea. George Rogers Clark knew hesitation would destroy their morale. He plunged immediately into the chest-deep freezing water. He smashed through the thin ice with his body. The desperate soldiers followed their fearless commander right in. The freezing water immediately shocked their exhausted nervous systems. They held their heavy rifles high above their heads. Dry gunpowder was their only hope for ultimate survival. Shivering men stumbled over hidden logs in the dark. The icy water reached their frozen chins in places. Weaker men started to physically collapse from severe hypothermia. Stronger soldiers grabbed them before they could drown completely. Clark ordered his men to sing loud marching songs. Their echoing voices fought back the terrifying freezing silence. They waded slowly through this brutal hell for hours. Nobody had eaten a single meal in 4 days. Their numb legs dragged through thick mud, underwater blindly. A few men found small islands to rest briefly. Most men just kept walking to avoid freezing completely. Clark sent small canoes to rescue the weakest fighters. The fort at Vincennes was finally getting very close. They reached dry land near the town by sunset. The exhausted men collapsed onto the cold, wet grass. They were freezing cold, but they were incredibly alive. They somehow crossed an absolutely impossible flooded winter barrier. But their greatest tactical challenge was just starting now. Hamilton had no idea these starving ghosts were coming. The British commander still felt perfectly secure and safe. Clark prepared to execute his brilliant and deadly illusion. The small frontier army was about to look massive. He needed them to think 1,000 men arrived. The psychological warfare would begin in just a moment. Fort Sackville would never survive this coming night attack. The real battle for the American West starts now. George Rogers Clark commanded only 170 men. Fort Sackville possessed thick walls and heavy British cannons. A direct frontal assault would be a suicidal disaster. Clark needed to create a massive and terrifying illusion. He wanted the British to think thousands were attacking. The clever commander sent a warning message into town. He told the local civilians to stay safely inside. He promised brutal vengeance against anyone helping the British. The frightened townspeople quickly surrendered to the confident Americans. Now Clark had to fool the British garrison completely. He gathered dozens of different flags from his men. The clever soldiers attached them to very long poles. There was a small ridge located near the fort. Clark marched his tiny army behind this exact ridge. The British soldiers could only see the waving flags. Clark marched his men in a continuous wide circle. They kept marching around the hill over and over. It looked like an endless line of fresh reinforcements. The terrified British counted dozens of different unit flags. Hamilton assumed a massive American army had finally arrived. He never suspected they were just freezing, starving frontiersmen. Clark fired his men up for the night attack. The psychological trap was now perfectly set in place. The master illusion had completely shattered British enemy morale, but the real fighting had not even started yet. The dark night would bring absolute terror and chaos. The frontiersmen loaded their deadly accurate, long hunting rifles. They crept silently toward the heavy timber fort walls. The British cannons sat silently in the dark night. Clark prepared to unleash total hell on Fort Sackville. The shocking midnight siege was about to finally begin. Nobody could predict the brutal violence coming very soon. Hamilton was about to face a deadly, unseen nightmare. The freezing ghost army was ready for bloody revenge. They wanted payback for all the murdered pioneer families. The bloody climax of this insane mission was here. Darkness completely swallowed the heavily armed British fort. The freezing American riflemen crept forward very silently. They hid behind fences and houses near the walls. Suddenly, a massive wall of gunfire erupted instantly. The midnight siege of Fort Sackville finally began. British soldiers inside initially thought it was a joke. They assumed friendly locals were shooting their guns. Then the deadly lead bullets started hitting men. Panic quickly swept through the shocked British garrison. Hamilton ordered his heavy cannons to return fire. But the British artillery proved to be completely useless. The American frontiersmen carried highly accurate long rifles. They aimed directly at the narrow cannon gun ports. Every time a British soldier opened a small window, deadly sniper fire immediately struck them in the face. The terrified cannoneers abandoned their massive heavy guns. The relentless American rifle fire never stopped all night. Clark ordered his men to keep shooting constantly. They fired from different angles to create total confusion. Hamilton realized his desperate situation was getting worse. The massive wooden walls could not protect his men. The frontier snipers rarely missed their intended targets. These woodsmen shot small animals for basic survival. Hitting a British soldier was incredibly easy for them. The completely trapped British commander felt sheer absolute terror. He faced an invisible army hiding in the darkness. The Americans wanted revenge for the burned settler cabins. They fought for their murdered families and lost friends. Surrender seemed like the only logical option left now. But Clark planned to send a much darker message. The morning sun would reveal a very bloody scene. Psychological warfare was about to reach a brutal peak. Hamilton was going to learn a very painful lesson. The hair buyer would finally face frontier justice. The terrifying siege was entering its most violent phase. The true horror of frontier warfare was now here. These freezing men refused to show any mercy today. Their final victory was getting closer by the minute. Morning sunlight finally broke over the battered wooden fort. The relentless American gunfire suddenly stopped for a moment. A native raiding party approached the fort completely unaware. They carried fresh, bloody scalps from dead American settlers. They expected a warm welcome from the British commander. Instead, they walked straight into a deadly American ambush. Clark captured the stunned raiders without losing a man. He decided to send a truly horrific psychological message. The frontier commander dragged the captives near the gates. British soldiers watched the terrifying scene from the walls. Clark ordered his angry men to raise their tomahawks. They executed the captured raiders right before Hamilton's eyes. The brutal violence shocked the watching British garrison completely. Clark threw the bloody bodies directly into the river. He washed the fresh blood off his own hands. Then he stared fiercely at the silent British fort. The grim message to the British was absolutely clear. This same bloody fate waited for every British soldier. If Hamilton refused to surrender, they would all die. The American frontiersmen would show absolutely no mercy today. Hamilton watched this brutal execution and lost his nerve. His disciplined professional soldiers were shaking with total fear. The legendary hair-buyer general was now completely broken. His psychological defenses crumbled under the extreme American terror. He quickly realized his massive walls could not save him. The tiny, starving ghost army had completely defeated him. He finally ordered his men to raise a white flag. The impossible winter siege was rapidly coming to an end. A new chapter in American history was about to start. The unmapped wilderness would never be the exact same again. Clark stood victorious in the freezing cold winter mud. His exhausted men cheered wildly for their brilliant commander. They had survived the most deadly march in history. Now they held the keys to the Western Empire. The British grand strategy was completely shattered into pieces. The final incredible consequences would soon shock the world. Hamilton officially surrendered Fort Sackville on February 24th. The notorious hair-buyer general walked out completely defeated. 170 starving Americans accepted his sword. The kill ratio for this brutal campaign is absurd. Clark did not lose a single man during combat. His frozen soldiers achieved a completely impossible military miracle. They defeated a heavily armed fortress without taking casualties. This forgotten winter victory completely changed American history forever. The British lost control of the entire western frontier. Their massive spring offensive against Kentucky never actually happened. Pioneer families finally slept safely in their small cabins. When the American Revolution ended, diplomats drew new borders. The British wanted to keep the vast western wilderness, but the Americans claimed they already conquered this land. Because of George Rogers Clark, the United States expanded. The new nation secured the massive Northwest Territory entirely. This single midnight invasion literally doubled America in size. 5 modern states were carved from this conquered wilderness. Military academies still study this brilliant psychological warfare today. Clark used the brutal terrain as his greatest weapon. He turned his starving men into an unstoppable nightmare. The frozen Wabash River could not save the British. This story proves that absolute sheer willpower wins battles. Impossible odds mean nothing against truly desperate frontier fighters. The British came expecting to fight a conventional war. Clark gave them a terrifying ghost who never quit. He struck his enemy from the frozen watery abyss. He fed them wild lies that they believed completely. The hair-buyer general never saw the fatal trap. By the time he realized it, he was destroyed. The ground at Vincennes is very quiet and peaceful today. But the legacy of that freezing march lives on. If you enjoyed this wild breakdown of military history, make sure you hit that subscribe button right now. Drop a comment about this insane freezing winter march. We cover forgotten tactical masterclasses like this every week. You will not want to miss the next video.